sons and the Danaids, all right, or Danaids. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. But apparently Egyptus had 50 sons. And he set his sons to get married to his brother's daughters. And his brother tells his daughters to murder their husbands on their wedding night. So according to the legend, 49 of the 50 sons actually got murdered. And then the 50th son who didn't get murdered avenged his brother's deaths. And so this is a little mythology tied around Egypt. So I want you guys to go ahead and write this down because we're going to keep it moving. I just want to make sure that we get this. Oh yeah, I didn't even talk about this. We'll talk about this really quickly. We're going to get into this later. But the ancient name that the Egyptians called Egypt was Tamari. Okay? So we can see a few things here, okay? So we already know Ta and Mary have a few different meanings, and you'll actually hear be pronounced Tamara or Tamara, okay? But what we should know is Ta and Mary, etymologically, we know that the syllables actually break up the phonetical meanings of both of those sounds. So we've got Tamari, and we can actually go ahead and relate that to who? Ta, okay? That's easy. Now, I'm sure that somebody else has their own proclamation of exactly what the meaning is, but that's right there in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. It's right there, Ta, Mary. And then you also have Mary meaning stone. Okay, so if we were to combine those words, that would be Ta stone, or the stone of Ta. Interesting, the stone of Ta. The stone of Ta. Tamari. What does that also sound like? If we were to reverse the syllables, it would be Mary Ta. Interesting. Mary Ta. Tamari. Kind of sounds like this place I know. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. Make sure you get the notes because we're going to be going on to the next board scribble. Hopefully you can read all that stuff, and what I'll do is I'll zoom in as well.
This is true for some periods, but for others, like the ancient empire, we know very little. And that's why, finally, your questions are ours. When it comes to the building of the pyramids, we have a lot of theories, but no written account.
Appendix B, the problem with Egyptian chronology. In 1886, historian George Rawlinson began his chapter on Egyptian chronology with this statement. It is a patent fact, and one that is beginning to obtain general recognition, that the chronological element in early Egyptian history is in a state of almost hopeless obscurity. There are several kinds of chronological documents, including the actual monuments. The chronological value of these various sources of information is, however, in every case, slight. The great defect of these monuments is their incompleteness. The Egyptians had no era. They drew out no chronological schemes. They cared nothing but to know how long each incarnate god, human or bovine, had condescended to tarry on the earth. They recorded carefully the length of life of each Apis bull and the length of the reign of each king, but they neglected to take note of the intervals between one Apis bull and another, and omitted to distinguish the sole reign of a monarch from his joint reign with others.
And we are back. You can go ahead and take these notes here. So what we're going to be doing now is we're going to take a detailed trip through scripture, and in particularly, we're going to be highlighting Egypt. And in each place that Egypt comes up. Now, obviously, Egypt and Canaan are places that are mentioned, I don't know, a lot. Probably over, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think Egypt has over 400 mentions. Okay, so I looked at all 400 of them, but I'm not going to present you with every time the word Egypt comes up, because we're really just looking to really just try to understand certain things. Now, if there's a place where Egypt comes up that that should be looked at, that maybe I haven't covered throughout this video, definitely bring it to my attention, which I will be happy to look at, because more so than anything, right now, too much information doesn't exist. So any information that we can credibly ascertain that leads us to the truth is well worth the time of investigation. So first, we are going to be looking at the first time that the word Egypt is brought up in scripture. Now, I want to make this point again. In the first part, we define the differences between Mitzrayim and Egypt. So for consumption purposes, I'm just going to be using Egypt throughout, because that is the tongue in which I speak. This is a bastardized Greek variation of whatever language that they were trying to hide. So what we're trying to do now is just figure out what are the characteristics of Egypt. So in Genesis 12:10, which is the first mention of Egypt in the Old Testament, or really in the Torah, Genesis 12:10. Okay? Now, in what context is Egypt mentioned? So there was a famine in the land, and of course, Abram, at the time, him and his wife Sarai, go down to Egypt to sojourn, or to basically take refuge. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the story, but we could talk about that a little bit later. Okay, the point of this is just to say, okay, there was a famine in the land and they went to Egypt as a place of refuge. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and put a famine refuge in terms of a theme that can be legitimately ascertained just by reading Genesis 12:10. So what that means is they had food. More so than anything, we know that there was food in Egypt, all right? So now there was a whole story that happened, and eventually Abram ends up leaving Egypt with more riches. He literally goes down to Egypt, and he's literally afraid of his life because he's got a beautiful wife, and he tells his wife to say, if we get captured, tell me you're my sister so I can live. And of course, she does that, and by virtue of another man taking his wife, that other guy gets cursed, and of course, gives Abraham all of these gifts, and Abraham leaves Egypt with more than he came with. Okay, so that is another theme, all right? That is another theme, okay? So more than just a place of refuge, it's actually a place that you can come up out of and might be on the good side. So we don't know how broke or poor or how, humble Abram was at the time before he went to Egypt. I imagine he had to be somewhat humble if he didn't have food to feed himself and his wife, and he literally had to go somewhere else to get food. But when he returns from Egypt, he returns with riches. So you can go live the American dream or the Egyptian dream. So in the next time that we see Egypt, it is in Genesis 26, and Isaac is being told not to go into Egypt. Again, there's another famine in the land, and he is being instructed to not go into Egypt. So I really want to stay here for a second, because once again, we can still tie in the fact that obviously Egypt is the place that seems to be a common location of refuge when there's no food, people go to Egypt. And that can easily be established through the first two right there, 12:10 to 26, all right? do not go into Egypt. And this is during the time that Isaac received the promise. We see in Genesis 26, we can see that Isaac dwelt in Gerar and did not go into Egypt. So the next time we see Egypt, or next time Egypt becomes a major part of the story, is really when we get into the children of Isaac, especially once we're talking about the sons and the brothers. And in particular, we're going to be talking about Joseph. So the story of Joseph starts a few chapters after Isaac. We're in Genesis 37 now. So during the story of Joseph, he was feeling himself. I'm just going to paraphrase. Joseph was feeling himself, and he was kind of like, he was like LaMelo Ball. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying LaMelo Ball feels like this, but imagine LaMelo, is it LaMelo? Yeah. Imagine LaMelo thinking he's the best ball brother, but he's the baby. And all the brothers have already paid their dues and went to war and everything. Well, Joseph was like that. He was the baby, and apparently he was more comely as well. So not only was he the baby, but basically because he was the youngest, he got to reap all the benefits from all of the wars and battles that his brothers had fought and won. During this, obviously, he exalted himself, and this in turn caused a little jealousy among his brothers. Long story short, and he obviously was receiving favor from his father, and his brothers wasn't feeling it. So they sold him. All right. They sold him to some Ishmaelites. They didn't know exactly what to do with him. They had him in the pit for a little bit, trying to decide what to do. And eventually they sold him. Now, this is kind of a crazy part of the story, because they sold their brother, but the brothers had to hide the lie. Think about it. We're talking about Levi, Simeon, Judah, Benjamin. They all had to hide the fact that they had sold their brother to Ishmaelites and they took Egypt. They had to hide that from their father, who was distraught. So Joseph gets sold, goes down into Egypt, and once again, we start to see a come up, right? So he ends up serving under Potiphar, who is the captain of the Pharaohic guard. So he ends up serving for Potiphar. He just happens to be part of the king's guard, or what they call the Pharaohic guard. Now, going back up, and we're going to stop here because this is kind of what I wanted you to see here when we're talking about Pharaohic and Pharaoh. Okay? So I want to go here because we're trying to figure out certain things. Okay? So the book of Jasher runs parallel to Genesis. For those of you who don't know, in many ways, sometimes even the chapters line up. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. Where if you go to chapter 12 in Genesis, it'll be chapter 12 in Jasher. Well, during this time, it actually is chapter 14. And they very similarly line up. And what you can do is chronologically just figure that out. So in Jasher, I forget exactly, I'm not going to go all the way and read Jasher, but I will read just an excerpt just to let you know exactly who was Pharaoh, okay? Who was Pharaoh, not at the time of Joseph, okay? But who was Pharaoh at the time of Abraham? Because we know that Joseph served under Potiphar, but Potiphar wasn't a Pharaoh, he was part of the Pharaohic guard. But we do know there was a Pharaoh in Egypt during the time that Abram and Sarai sojourned in Egypt. So when we read chapter 14 in the book of Jasher, this is how we can start to, I would say, cross-analyze our resources. So during those days that Abraham was sojourning in Egypt, and I'm going to see here, I believe that's in, so it's just after chapter 13. So we're going to go to chapter 14 really quickly. And I'm just going to read from the book of Jasher, and you can get a little more insight into what's going on, okay? So I had just gone to chapter 13 to make sure it's during the same chronological time period as Abram and Sarai, just to double check again. So I'm going to start at Jasher 14:1. In those days, there was in the land of Shinar a wise man who had understanding and all wisdom and of a beautiful appearance, but he was poor and indigent. His name was Richion, and he was hard set to support himself. And he resolved to go to Egypt to Osiris, the son of Anam, king of Egypt, to show the king his wisdom, for perhaps he might find grace in his sight, to raise him up, give him maintenance, and Richion did so. And when Richion came to Egypt, he asked the inhabitants of Egypt concerning the king, and the inhabitants of Egypt told him the custom of the king of Egypt. For it was the custom of the king of Egypt that when he went from his royal palace and was seen abroad only one day in the year. And after that, the king would return to his palace and remain there for the rest of the year. And on the day that the king went forth, he passed judgment in the land. And everyone having a suit came before the king that day to obtain his request. And when Richion heard of this custom in Egypt, and that he could not come into the presence of the king, he grieved greatly and was very sorrowful. And in the evening, Richion went out and found a house in ruins, formerly a bake house in Egypt. And he abode there all night in bitterness of soul and pinched with hunger. And sleep was removed from his eyes. And Richion considered within himself what he should do in the town until the king made his appearance, and how he might maintain himself there. And there he arose in the morning and walked about, and met in his way those who sold vegetables and various sorts of seed with which they supplied the inhabitants. And Richion wished to do the same in order to get a maintenance in the city. But he was unacquainted with the custom of the people, and he was like a blind man among them. And he went and obtained vegetables to sell for his support, and the rabble assembled about him and ridiculed him, and took his vegetables from him and left him nothing. And then he rose up from there in bitterness of soul, and he went sighing to the bakehouse in which he had remained all the night before, and he slept there the second night. And on that night again he reasoned within himself, how could he save himself from starvation? And he devised a scheme how to act. And he rose up in the morning and acted ingeniously, and went and hired 30 strong men of the rabble, carrying their war instruments in their hands, and he led them to the top of the Egyptian sepulchre, and he placed them there. Now I want to stop here. The thing that kind of got me about this story, now I've read the story quite a few times, is that we know Richion was broke, or we think he was broke. So I always wondered how he was able to hire the rabble and go to the Egyptian sepulchre, okay? So, like I said, we're just reading the story about Richion, all right, who was the first pharaoh, and we're getting into why he's called pharaoh. Just follow along. And let's see here, where do we leave off? And he commanded them, saying, thus saith the king, strengthen yourselves. Okay, maybe as I'm looking at this, maybe he just uses the king of his, maybe he's using the king's word to his favor, as opposed to really paying them to do it. Maybe there was some, I don't know, some exchange that was other than just 200 pieces of silver or whatever it would be. So maybe there was some other exchange. And he commanded them, saying, thus saith the king, strengthen yourselves and be valiant men, and let no man be buried here until 200 pieces of silver be given, and then he may be buried. And those men did according to the order of Richion to the people of Egypt the whole of that year. And in 8 months' time, Richion and his men gathered great riches of silver and gold, and Richion took a great quantity of horses and other animals, and he hired more men, and he gave them horses, and they remained with him. And when the year came round at the time the king went forth into the town, all the inhabitants of Egypt assembled together to speak to him concerning the work of Richion and all his men. And the king went forth on the appointed day, and all the Egyptians came before him and cried unto him, saying, May the king live forever. What is this thing thou doest in the town to thy servants, not to suffer a dead body to be buried until much silver and gold be given? Was there ever the like unto this done in the whole earth from the days of former kings, yea, even from the days of Adam and to this day, that the dead should not be buried only for a set price? We know it to be a custom of kings to take a yearly tax from the living, but thou dost not only do this, but from the dead also thou exactest a tax day by day? Now, O king, we can no more bear this, for the whole city is ruined on this account. And dost thou not know it? And then the king heard all they had spoken. He was very wroth, and his anger burned within him at this affair, for he had known nothing of it. And the king said, Who and where is he that dares to do this wicked thing in my land without my command? Surely you will tell him. And they told him all the works of Richion and all his men. And the king's anger was aroused, and he ordered Richion and his men to be brought before him. And Richion took about 1,000 children, sons and daughters, clothed them in silk and embroidery, and he set them upon horses and sent them to the king by means of this. And he also took a great quantity of silver and gold and precious stones, and a strong, beautiful horse as a present for the king, with which he came before the king and bowed down to the earth before him. And the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt wondered at the work of Richion, and they saw his riches and presented, and the present that he had brought to the king. And it greatly pleased the king, and he wondered at it. And when Richion sat before him, the king asked him concerning all of his works. And Richion spoke all his words wisely before the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt. And when the king heard the works of Richion and his wisdom, Richion found grace in his sight, and he met with the grace and kindness from all the servants of the king, from all the inhabitants of Egypt, on the account of his wisdom and excellent speeches. And from that time they loved him exceedingly. And the king answered and said to Richion, Thy name shall no more be called Richion, but Pharaoh shall be thy name, since thou didst exact a tax from the dead. And he called his name Pharaoh. And the king and his subjects loved Richion for his wisdom, and they consulted with all the inhabitants of Egypt to make him prefect under the king. And all the inhabitants of Egypt and his wise men did so, and it was made law in Egypt. And they made Richion Pharaoh prefect under Osiris, king of Egypt. And Richion Pharaoh governed over Egypt, daily administering justice to the whole city. But Osiris the king would judge the people of the land one day in the year, when he went out to make his appearance. And Richion Pharaoh cunningly usurped the government of Egypt, and he exacted a tax from all of the inhabitants of Egypt. And all of the inhabitants of Egypt greatly loved Richion Pharaoh, and they made a decree to call every king that should reign over them and their seed in Egypt Pharaoh. Therefore, all the kings that reigned in Egypt from that time forward were called Pharaoh unto this day. Wow. Richion devised a scheme to charge people to bury their loved ones. Over the span of approximately 8 months, he gathered so many riches that he sent lavish gifts, animals, silver and gold to the king. Once he was able to do this, he got favor with the king. And according to Jasher 14, he spoke wisely to the king. And the king called him Pharaoh. He exacted a tax from the dead. Just want to make sure I put this here. Pharaoh taxes the dead. Just just want you guys to understand the foundational meaning of the word Pharaoh. I don't know if that means dead body tax collector. I don't know how that's broken up. But we do know from Jasher that he is called Pharaoh because he exacted a tax from the dead. This was during the life of Abraham. Abraham goes down during a famine with his wife Sarai. Abraham leaves Egypt with more than he came. Genesis 26, don't go into Egypt because there's another famine. Dwell in Gerar. Joseph, sold by his brothers to Ishmaelites, ends up in Egypt working under Potiphar. Now we could go on, we could tell the long story of Joseph, but all you really need to know is Joseph became great in Egypt. All right? So once again, we have another story of somebody going down into Egypt and coming out on top. All right? So Joseph became so great in Egypt, they honored him. He had lands, he had riches, he had everything. And furthermore, and I think this is really huge, he saved the country from famine. Genesis 50:26, Joseph dies. Now, after Joseph dies, we are now going to the book of Exodus. Now remember, the theme here is Egypt. We're not getting into every portion of biblical history. We're highlighting Egypt, all right? So, after the death of Joseph, the new king in Egypt knew not the works of Joseph or the legend of his family. So the new king in Egypt did not have any reverence for Joseph. And what happened after that? He started oppressing the Israelites. In addition to oppressing, and this is another thing that we're going to be hitting on throughout a few different stories in scripture, okay? And we're just gonna call this the massacre of the innocents, to kill newborn sons, okay? So, not only did the new king in Egypt have no love for Joseph, he had no love for Joseph's family, he also wanted to kill all newborn sons who are Israelites. So, and this is a story that we've heard before. Now, I don't know, you don't just hear it, because you're going to hear this story twice in the Exodus, okay? You're going to hear it once, where the Pharaoh commands, or the king of Egypt commands all the midwives to kill all of the Hebrew boys, but the girls can live, okay? The whole point was, it was a population control thing. The king of Egypt was looking to diminish the Israelite numbers, all right? But the theme of killing firstborn sons is something that we're going to see throughout the Bible, throughout scripture. This is something that we actually saw before the story of Abraham, okay? So in the beginning of Genesis, between Abraham and Isaac, or between Terah and Isaac and Abraham and Jacob, we see that there is a theme that people want to kill firstborn sons of certain nations, of certain people. Now, in many ways, I think there's probably a lot of prophecy tied into it, and they're probably using astrological, signs in the skies to determine there's a new star in the east when somebody's born today, blah, blah, blah. We've seen that before. We saw it with Abraham, and of course, we heard it somewhere else also. So these are themes that we see throughout the Bible. This is something that we're going to see again. Okay. So I just wanted to put that on the paper. Now we're going to get into, before I'm going to clean off the board, then we're going to get into Exodus here. We'll get into the Exodus, and then we're going to start getting into Chronicles, and then we're going to start getting into some of the prophets, okay? So right now, I just wanted to kind of get the story of Egypt leading up into the Exodus, okay? So, long story short, they didn't fuck with the Israelites. Long story short, the king knew not the works of Joseph. He didn't know that Joseph saved the whole entire country from famine. He doesn't care. Let's see here. Yeah, Exodus is right there in Exodus chapter 1. Exodus 1:13 says he began oppressing the children of Israel under rigorous bondage. Okay? So when we get back to here, we're gonna come back and we're gonna come to the rise of Moses. All right. So go ahead and take these notes here. When we get back, we'll be in the middle of the Exodus at the rise of Moses, and we'll be, for those of you who saw the Exodus in America video, this is gonna tie along a lot with that information. But if you did see that video, then you understand a lot more deeply the Exodus route. So what I did in the Exodus in America video is I took all of the information about the Exodus during that time period, and I basically extrapolated everything from dates to time travel, how far they traveled, and where could they actually have traveled from based upon the information that we have in the book. So, and that'll be interesting because I think these travel rates and speeds are major, okay? So if, for example, if it takes Ezra 5 months to travel between Jerusalem and Babylon, then the implication there is there's probably at least 1,500 to 2,000 miles, if not more, in between, okay? Now, we know that the current location of Jerusalem and Babylon is approximately the distance from Atlanta to New York, which on foot would take about no longer than 2 weeks, give or take. And then what you start finding out is that the Exodus was 2 million people. So how could the Exodus with 2 million people travel faster than Ezra? Ezra didn't travel by himself. He had some families with him, but he didn't have 2 million people with him. So these are all gargantuan holes in their proposed theories. And we're just now getting to the part where we can start to pick this stuff up and decipher the bullshit. So anyway, go ahead and take these notes, and when we come back, we'll be more. We'll take a more detailed look at the Exodus, and then we're going to be off the Exodus because I've gone over the Exodus before, but the Exodus is up out of Egypt once again, and we'll be playing with these themes again. Once again, here's what we're going to see. Again, as a theme in Egypt, we're going to see how once again the Israelites are being oppressed in Egypt. And then the Exodus does what? What happens during the Exodus? And so we're still what? We're still riding the same theme of you're going down into it and up out of it. All right? Take the notes.
Since Homo sapiens are the same all over the world, obviously when we face the same problems, we will come up with the same answers.
To get the same answer in 4 parallel streams makes it, to me, seems very unlikely. It's hard to imagine that the Incas went anywhere near Egypt. I find that a bit hard to believe.
I find you motherfuckers hard to believe.
If all these sites were built at different times, they can't have been built by the same people. But monuments can't be dated. Only the organic remains found nearby. So did the Incas really build Machu Picchu? Did the Egyptians really build the pyramids?
Okay, we are back. So now we're at the Exodus. The story is the Israelites are being oppressed in Egypt, and something has to be done. And it seems as though God and or some angel is revealed to Moses, okay? So at this point, this is when he makes the request of Pharaoh to let my people go. Now, of course, Pharaoh does not hearken or listen to Moses, and then you have a string of events that takes place throughout Exodus, probably some of the more popular stories that you've heard about the plagues. And so Moses at this point leads the Israelites out of Egypt. And of course, they're about to cross the Red Sea. The Pharaoh actually changes his mind and starts to pursue. They get to one side of the sea. Pharaoh pursues into the sea, and the sea takes up the entire Egyptian army as they're pursuing after the Israelites. So from that point on, historically, Egypt's role becomes dramatically diminished. All right? So at this point, at the point that the Pharaoh's guard is drowned in the Red Sea, the role of Egypt has greatly diminished from what it once was. Remember, it used to be the place with the most food, the place of refuge, the place where people who were broke, tired, sick, and hungry, they went to Egypt. Sounds like a place that I'm thinking of that exists today. So, after the death of Moses, if you guys remember, Moses dies as he's trying to lead the children into the land of Canaan. But Moses, basically, he was the best military commander in the history of the Israelites. But he wasn't completely faithful. And I forget exactly what happened, but he smited the rock, and when the water wouldn't come out. So those were called the waters of contention. And that is when the faith in Moses got tested. And this, there's many themes in the story, but I think it's a major theme. The fact that Moses is probably one of the most righteous and definitely one of the most heralded characters and figures from the biblical past. Even he didn't get to make it over into Canaan. He didn't actually get to see the promised land. He actually saw the promised land. He didn't get to be in the promised land. Which, you know, I think there's something in that story, just for the fact that that small lack of faith that he had. Now, was it because Moses had the lack of faith that he wasn't able to see? Or was it because he lacked faith in front of the other Israelites? I've often wondered that. If Moses in his mind goes through something where he wants the water to come out of the rock rather than, you know, being outwardly frustrated, would inward frustration also result in the same punishment of not being able to see the land? I've often wondered about that. Is it just being able to control your mind or your actions? And anyway, that's more of a philosophical question as to why Moses was punished. Was it the thought, or was it the action that actually caused the punishment? So getting back, so after the death of Moses, Joshua takes over. So if you remember the story of Joshua and Caleb, these were the two spies that spied on the land of Canaan. They were the only ones who brought back positive reports. All of the other spies, 10 of the 12 spies, were some bitch-ass niggas, and eventually that entire generation had to die in the wilderness. So at that time, we've got Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, okay? So I'm sure Caleb is in a leadership role, but we're specifically talking about Joshua and the book of Joshua, what comes after Exodus. So after Moses' death, Joshua is the main commander at this time. Also, there seems to be a theme that kind of gets lost in much of this. These are war stories, okay? Just as much as these guys were men, it seems as though there's some sort of military commander and or general, okay? So these aren't just people walking around and saying, hey, let my people go. When you read the book, you'll notice that there are wars, and it's really interesting because there's no play-by-play, anything like that. It says, hey, well, there is a little bit of play-by-play, but he'll say, you know, we went over here, we utterly smited them niggas, and we over here, and they utterly smited them dudes. So, I don't even know if they use the word utterly, but some cats got smited. That's all I'm gonna say about that. So what happened is, Josh, and it says in Joshua 3:10, without fail, that he was going to drive out the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. and it doesn't mention the Egyptians. So I often thought this was interesting here. So it says without fail in Joshua 3:10 that he's going to drive out all of these nations, but specifically it does not mention the Egyptians, at least not driven from the land in Joshua 3:10. Now, you'll go back into later, if you go back into later chapters of Joshua. So in Joshua 3:10, it'll say that he'll drive out these people, me contrasting. It'll say that he'll drive out these nations without fail. However, other nations still dwell unto this day. So, obviously the truth is somewhere between those 2 points. And that's something that we can look at if we know that it says that without fail, he drove out many nations, and then Joshua 3:10 names the nations. Okay? Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites, but not Egyptians. Very interesting. Now, I'm trying to figure out if he drove out all of these other nations, how can they still dwell unto this day? So maybe it is a sense of maybe he just annexed the lands that belonged to the other nations, or maybe he took over those territories where he took over lands, but not necessarily the people of the lands, where it's like, hey, this is our land now, but you can stay here type thing. We still really need some clarity to the context of everyone being driven out, because we know everybody wasn't driven out. Okay, they still dwell in the lands until this day. But even the idea is that everybody was supposed to be driven off the land. Now remember that the land of Canaan had borders. But then as it says in, what is this? It says in Joshua, it says in Joshua chapter 11, verse 23, it says that he took the entire land, or took the whole land, and gave it as an inheritance to Israel, which means there's a chance that he just took all the land, no matter who it belonged to. So there are a couple of things that we really need to try to work out in terms of what it's actually saying versus what we're reading. But I also wanted to hit this point here. Joshua takes Goshen, all right? So this is major here. So it says he drove out all of these nations. He did not drive out the Egyptians as is written in Joshua 3:10. But I think it's huge. It says that he took Goshen, all right? And we know that Goshen is what? Egypt, right? Goshen was the part of Egypt that was supposedly attributed to the house of Ramses, and also attributed to where Joseph had land. And if I'm not mistaken, Goshen was supposed to be the best of the land. And I can't remember what verse it is, but it actually said that not historically, but in the Bible, it said that the land's a desert now, but it used to be well watered. Okay. I can't remember. If it comes up during this, of course, I'll bring it up. But what I wanted to say here is we know that Joshua took Goshen, and we know Goshen is part of Egypt. All right. So these are things, he took and here's the thing, he took a ton of lands. Okay. If you read Joshua, he took everything. Okay. He took it all. But these are the reason I really like Goshen is because we know it's Egypt. We can make a clear parallel. We can make a clear connection between Goshen and Egypt. Okay. So now that Joshua's taken all these territories, of course, this is the theme also. You know, we're talking about themes. There are multiple themes, right? So we've talked about going down into Egypt, being broke when you're in Egypt. And the next thing you know, you're coming out of Egypt with money. You know what I'm saying? Everything, the Israelites were downtrodden into Egypt. They come up out of Egypt. But just like this, after the death of Joshua, the children went back to their evil ways. So this is another cyclical theme throughout biblical history, is that the people just can't stay righteous for any elongated span of time. It seems as soon as there's any sort of peace in the nation, then it doesn't last too long. It seems as though after they get out of the oppression, they get it together for a little bit, but it doesn't last long. So in this case, after the death of Joshua, the children went back to their whorish ways. So once again, this is another reoccurring thing. So this is really what you get left with, and this is in Judges. So this is after the death of Joshua. Judges is the next book. So at this point, like I said, Egypt has a diminished role, and we can actually see, like in a straight line parallel, that we can see Joshua actually controls Goshen and plenty of other territories that used to be considered Egypt. We don't know if he has controlled the entirety of Egypt, but it does say that he took the whole land in 1123. So I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, but what we know is from this point on, the kingdom starts to descend a little bit. Now we're looking at the days of the United Kingdom, and you would think that, hey, and these are supposed to be the good days, but everybody knows there was a lot of war and there's just a hot mess in these years here. And, Solomon got to build the temple. David didn't get to build the temple. And then after Solomon and his children take over, of course, that's when the kingdom becomes divided again. So during the divided kingdom is really when Egypt comes back as a player against the children of Israel. So go ahead and take these notes. All right, so after Solomon, of course, after the days of Solomon, this is where the king becomes divided again, okay? And once the kingdom is divided, of course it falls. Together we stand, divided we fall, right? So there are generations to where you had the rulers of Israel and the rulers of Judah, okay? And so these were divisions of the kingdom, all right? And so during this time, this is really when the nation descended into chaos and ultimately lost control again. So although the United Kingdom starts, it starts in the days of Saul. It finishes in the days of Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Jehoiahaz and Zedekiah, okay? So we're going to be talking about that, and mainly this is going to be a result of Josiah's decision, okay? Okay, as stated, the divided kingdom falls, all right? So why did the kingdom fall? Well, there are a ton of reasons that we don't even really have to get into because we're not talking about the kingdom, we're talking about Egypt. But in Chronicles 35, and specifically in 2 Chronicles 35, 20 through 24, 2 Chronicles 35, 20 through 24, we want to talk about Josiah for a second, okay? So Josiah decided that he wanted to go to war against Necho II, king of Egypt. Now, as written, Necho says, "Your God is with me." In other words, Necho the Egyptian king says, "Your God is with me, and that you shouldn't stand in my way during this war, or you should probably just help me out." Something to that effect. Okay, I guess you can read all about it, but it's king of Egypt, Necho II, all right? So what did Josiah do? Josiah decided to deceive the king, and ultimately that, more or less ended with the fall of the kingdom. Chronicles 36, 1 through 7. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he was named king, but Necho made Eliakim who was 25 years old, king after 3 months, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim did evil in the sight of the Lord and was bound by Nebuchadnezzar and promoted Jehoiachin, who reigned in his stead and also did evil. So, a couple of things to reconcile here. We know that the kingdom ended with Josiah when Josiah went against Necho II. All right? Now, the people named Jehoahaz, the 23-year-old king. But Necho made Eliakim, the 25-year-old king, after 3 months and changed his name to Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim did evil in the sight of the Lord and was bound by Nebuchadnezzar and promoted Jehoiachin, who was 8 years old, who reigned and also did evil. So you're not too young to do evil, apparently. Well, I'm sure Jehoiachin was doing evil after the age of 8, but also did evil. So from this point on, the kingdom has fallen again, all right? So I just want you guys to understand something. After the kingdom is united, and then after Solomon, it becomes divided, and then there's a lot of infighting with the kingdom and other nations, and other nations set upon the kingdom, and the kingdom pretty much set upon itself, all right? Josiah decides that he's not going to listen to the king of Egypt who says, "Your God is with me." He deceives the king. As a result, he ends up dying through his ill will. And then the line of succession comes. And the line of succession ends with Jehoiachin, who reigned in Jehoiakim's stead. And so what we're going to do now we have the fall of the kingdom, all right? We've got a lot of stories that are being intermingled together. We've got a lot of different accounts. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get out of the historical part and we're going to get into prophecy, which is really some of my favorite stuff, because now we get to be a little more abstract as we're trying to decipher certain things. But it's like we approach things abstractly, but it's very encouraging that you approach something abstractly, but then by the time you're done researching, it comes to a definitive point. And that's something that we're going to see here. So what we're going to be doing is we're now going to be looking, especially at prophecy. We're going to be highlighting Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Daniel. So now that we have the history kind of caught up upon until the time that the kingdom falls in Chronicles, okay? And this is after Josiah, all right? This is long after the United Kingdom. This is long after the kingdom has been fighting. Now we're to the point just before Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, all right? So it's kind of, even reading about Nebuchadnezzar is a lot different than what we think about Nebuchadnezzar. So we're going to be looking at that as well, just in terms of what, sometimes biblically it seems as though through messages of other people that they present someone in a light that may not necessarily be a realistic light. I'm not saying Nebuchadnezzar was good, obviously not. But I think in terms of how we should look at him, it's probably somebody who's not as evil as maybe somebody thinks they are, even though he is pretty freaking evil. He also, for lack of a better word, he also elevated Daniel to the point of prophecy. And if it wasn't for Nebuchadnezzar's dreams and Daniel's prophecies, we probably wouldn't have a lot of the answers to things moving forward like we do now. So, many times things just happen for a reason. And so the cool thing is now we're going to get into the prophecy. So we're going to be looking at prophecies in Daniel. We're going to be looking at prophecies in Ezekiel. We're going to be looking at prophecies in Isaiah. And we're going to be paralleling them with things that have happened in history. So right now, and here's the thing. When we get into prophecy, this is like established history that's kind of already covered, all right? Once we start getting into prophecy, this is kind of like the gray area where things, you have the script hasn't been written. Okay? They're giving you an outline, and now you have to write the script. So that's gonna be pretty fun. So coming up next is prophecy. Cool? Take the notes.
The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. And they shall seek to the idols, and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians I will give over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and dried up, and they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of the fence shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither, the paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. The fishers shall also mourn, and all in that day that cast angle into the brooks shall lament, and they that spreadeth nets upon the waters shall languish. Moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave networks shall